With the elections coming up, we're flooded by narratives for different political parties. But what's the unbiased truth? Is there one? It's a good time to talk politics. First, let's start with the basics. Who has elections, and why does it matter? According to the Economist Intelligence Unit, EIU, and Freedom House, in October 2023, around 100 to 120 countries were classified as democratic to varying degrees. Meanwhile, the number of non-democratic countries generally ranges around 50 to 80, depending on the definitions and classifications used by different organizations. Non-democratic regimes can include authoritarian governments, totalitarian states, and various hybrid regimes where democratic practices are limited or manipulated. So what does it mean to be a democratically elected politician? A politician is an individual involved in politics, governance, and public policy making, with roles such as representing constituents, advocating for specific issues, negotiating legislation, and serving in government structures. They must adhere to ethical standards, transparency, and accountability. The President of the United States enforces federal laws, leads the armed forces, proposes legislation, represents the U.S. internationally, appoints federal judges, and plays a central role in economic policy. A good president who effectively enhances the quality of life and standard of living for the populace typically embodies several key qualities and practices. This includes visionary leadership, effective communication, empathy, policy knowledge and competence, collaborative governance, focus on economic development, commitment to social justice, investment in education and healthcare, environmental stewardship, adaptability and resilience, listening to constituents, and upholding democratic principles. Good and bad examples of U.S. presidents demonstrate varying leadership styles, decision-making, and policy implementation. The American president has a variety of powers balanced by checks from Congress, the judiciary, public opinion, and democratic processes. The policies of the Republican and Democratic parties differ in economic policy, healthcare, social issues, education, and environmental policy. Democrats emphasize climate change action, stricter environmental regulations, lenient immigration policies, and diplomacy in foreign policy. Republicans advocate for stricter immigration controls, military engagement, and prioritizing U.S. interests in foreign policy. The American president has a variety of powers, including executive, legislative, foreign affairs, and military powers. These powers are balanced by checks from Congress, the judiciary, public opinion, and democratic processes to ensure accountability and prevent abuse of power. The policies of the Republican and Democratic parties in the U.S. differ in areas like economic policy, healthcare, social issues, education, and environmental policy. Republicans generally support lower taxes and less regulation, while Democrats advocate for higher taxes, increased regulation, and social programs to address income inequality. So with the upcoming election period approaching, let us review both candidates, their strengths and weaknesses, and the agreed-upon guidelines on what would make a fitting president for the challenging times the world is facing. A quick introduction to both of the running contenders. Donald Trump, the 45th President of the United States, had a background in business, television, and politics. His career included real estate development, high-profile projects, financial difficulties, and his role as the host of The Apprentice before entering politics and winning the 2016 presidential election as a Republican. The presidency of Donald Trump, 2017 to 2021, had significant impacts on American politics, society, and policy. His tenure exacerbated political polarization, appointed conservative justices to the Supreme Court, implemented tax cuts, pursued an America First foreign policy, enacted strict immigration policies, was criticized for the handling of the COVID-19 pandemic, saw social movements and racial tensions, spread misinformation, and eroded trust in institutions. Meanwhile, Kamala Harris, the Vice President of the United States, has a diverse background in law and politics, focusing on issues like immigration reform, voting rights, economic recovery from COVID-19, and equity and justice. Her career showcases advocacy for progressive policies, social justice, in systemic change, despite controversies surrounding her tough-on-crime stance, handling of police misconduct cases, and conflicts with Joe Biden. Her presence as the first female, Black, and South Asian vice president is seen as a milestone for representation and diversity in American politics. Assessing Harris's impact on America is subjective, considering her accomplishments, controversies, challenges, and role as vice president. As before mentioned, a good president is one who embodies these qualities and can help create a more equitable, just, and prosperous society, ultimately leading to an improved quality of life and standard of living for all citizens. Let's start the comparison by the first metric. 1. Visionary leadership. A clear and inspiring vision for the future, prioritizing the well-being of the citizens and addressing key issues such as economic inequality, healthcare, education, and environmental sustainability. Donald Trump tends to focus on market-driven solutions, emphasizing economic growth and job creation as means to address inequality, while Kamala Harris acknowledges structural factors contributing to economic disparity and advocates for direct intervention through progressive taxation, expanded social programs, and measures to support marginalized communities. Their contrasting views reflect their broader ideological differences regarding the role of government in addressing economic issues. Donald Trump's approach to healthcare is characterized by a focus on market-driven strategies, a desire to repeal the ACA, and an emphasis on individual responsibility through measures like HSAs. In contrast, Kamala Harris's healthcare policies are centered on expanding access and equity, strengthening the ACA, and pursuing a more comprehensive system like Medicare for all. Their differing views on healthcare reflect broader ideological divides between Republican and Democratic approaches to health policy in the U.S. Donald Trump's environmental policies focus on deregulation, fossil fuel development, and economic growth, often at the expense of environmental protections. In contrast, Kamala Harris advocates for aggressive actions to combat climate change, emphasizing renewable energy, environmental justice, and international cooperation. Their differing views on environmental sustainability illustrate the broader ideological divide between Republican and Democratic approaches to environmental policy and climate change in the United States. Donald Trump's education policies focus on school choice, reducing federal involvement, and promoting vocational training, highlighting market-driven approaches. In contrast, Kamala Harris emphasizes equitable access to quality public education, increased funding for schools, early childhood education, and reforms to address student debt. Their differing perspectives reflect broader ideological divides regarding the role of government in education and the best methods to improve educational outcomes in the United States. Key differences. Policy focus. Trump's policies tend to focus on economic nationalism and immigration control, whereas Harris emphasizes social justice, healthcare access, and environmental sustainability. Communication and tone. Trump's communication style is often characterized as aggressive and combative, while Harris is generally seen as more collaborative and focused on inclusivity. Approach to governance. Trump's leadership was often defined by unilateral decision-making, while Harris advocates for engagement with various stakeholders and prioritizes compromise. 2. Effective communication. The ability to communicate policies and ideas clearly and transparently, fostering trust and engagement with the public. Donald Trump's communication style is characterized by assertiveness, emotional appeal, and provocative messaging, often aimed at energizing a loyal base. In contrast, Kamala Harris's style is marked by empathy, substance, and inclusivity, focusing on building connections and articulating policy details. Each approach has its strengths and resonates differently with various segments of the American electorate, reflecting their respective political ideologies and strategies. 3. Empathy. Understanding and acknowledging the diverse experiences and challenges faced by different groups within the population, leading to more inclusive policymaking. Kamala Harris is generally perceived as more empathetic than Donald Trump, particularly in the way she communicates and engages with diverse communities. Her storytelling, focus on inclusivity, and advocacy for social justice resonate with the concept of empathy and leadership. In contrast, while Trump can evoke strong emotional responses, his communication style tends to focus more on assertiveness and polarization, which may not effectively convey empathy in the same way. The perception of empathy, however, can be subjective and influenced by individual values and beliefs, making it important to consider audience perspectives in this comparison. Fourth, policy knowledge and competence. A sound grasp of economic, social, and political issues, allowing for informed decision-making that effectively addresses the needs and concerns of the citizenry. Kamala Harris is generally viewed as having stronger policy knowledge and competence, particularly in the areas of law, social justice, and progressive policies. Her educational background, legal experience, and direct engagement with policy issues contribute to a perception of thorough understanding and expertise. On the other hand, Donald Trump brought a different perspective with his business background and experience as president. While he demonstrated competence in specific economic policies, his overall approach often emphasized instinct and broad principles over detailed policy analysis. Ultimately, the assessment of policy knowledge and competence can vary based on personal beliefs and priorities, with supporters of each figure viewing their strengths differently. 5. Collaborative governance. Willingness to work with lawmakers, local governments, and various stakeholders across political lines to build consensus around policies that benefit society as a whole. Kamala Harris is generally seen as more adept at collaborative governance compared to Donald Trump. Harris's experience in the legislative branch focus on inclusion and coalition building, and her communication style contribute to her reputation as a collaborative leader. On the other hand, Trump's transactional and often confrontational approach to governance tends to limit collaboration and foster division. While he achieved certain policy goals, it was often through exerting executive power rather than through building consensus. Ultimately, the effectiveness of collaborative governance depends on leadership style, willingness to engage with diverse perspectives, and ability to foster a cooperative political environment. Based on these criteria, Kamala Harris appears to be more aligned with collaborative governance principles. 6. Focus on economic development, promoting job creation, supporting small businesses, and investing in infrastructure, education, and technology to stimulate the economy and improve living standards. In terms of focus on economic development, Donald Trump has largely centered his policies on tax cuts, deregulation, reviving manufacturing, and job creation through business-oriented initiatives. His emphasis on aggressive trade policies and a strong focus on corporate incentives seeks to stimulate economic growth directly. In contrast, Kamala Harris emphasizes economic equity, inclusivity, and sustainable development, advocating for investment in infrastructure, healthcare, education, and green jobs. Her approach to economic development is more holistic, considering social factors and long-term sustainability alongside traditional economic growth metrics. Ultimately, the assessment of who is more focused on economic development depends on one's values regarding economic models. Trump's more traditional business-centric approach versus Harris's focus on equity and sustainability in economic growth. Each approach reflects distinct policy priorities and visions for economic development. 7. Commitment to social justice. Advocating for policies that address inequality, discrimination, and access to resources, ensuring that all citizens have fair opportunities to succeed. In terms of commitment to social justice, Kamala Harris generally demonstrates a more consistent and comprehensive focus on issues related to equity, criminal justice reform, and support for marginalized communities. Her advocacy is rooted in a belief that social justice is integral to American democracy and governance. Donald Trump's approach, characterized by a focus on law and order and economic growth, has been more polarizing, with many critics arguing that his policies often neglect or exacerbate issues related to social justice. Overall, Harris's platform and history suggest a greater commitment to social justice initiatives compared to Trump's policies and rhetoric, which have often been viewed as more reactive than proactive in addressing these critical issues. 8. Investment in education and healthcare. prioritizing initiatives that improve access to quality education and healthcare, recognizing that these are foundational to a higher standard of living. Kamala Harris places a strong emphasis on increasing public investment in both education and healthcare, advocating for greater access, equity, and systemic reform. Her proposals focus on reducing the financial burden on students and families, expanding healthcare coverage, and addressing disparities in health and education. In contrast, Donald Trump has prioritized school choice and competition in education, while advocating for a repeal of the ACA and a more market-driven approach to healthcare. His policies generally emphasize privatization and reducing federal involvement in both sectors. Overall, Harris's approach tends to prioritize investment in equitable access, whereas Trump's approach is more focused on deregulation and market mechanisms. These differing philosophies result in significant contrasts in their proposed strategies for education and healthcare investment. 9. Environmental stewardship. Implementing sustainable practices and policies that protect the environment and address climate change, ensuring a livable planet for future generations. Kamala Harris has a strong commitment to environmental stewardship, emphasizing climate action, environmental justice, and sustainable development. Her policies aim to address climate change comprehensively and protect vulnerable communities disproportionately affected by environmental degradation. Donald Trump's approach, on the other hand, has been characterized by deregulation and a focus on promoting fossil fuels, often prioritizing economic growth over environmental protections. His administration's actions and policies have often been criticized for undermining environmental stewardship. In summary, Harris clearly focuses more on environmental stewardship and sustainability compared to Trump, whose policies have tended to favor economic interests that may conflict with environmental protections. 10. Adaptability and resilience. The ability to respond effectively to crises, be they economic downturns, public health emergencies, or natural disasters, demonstrating effective crisis management and recovery strategies. Kamala Harris demonstrates adaptability and resilience through her responsiveness to crises, a strong focus on social justice, and economic policies that prioritize equity. Her experience in law and public service has equipped her with better tools to address complex crises effectively. Donald Trump, while demonstrating resilience through his administration's economic measures during challenging times, has faced criticism for his handling of the COVID-19 pandemic and the lack of a consistent, adaptive approach to crisis management. In summary, while both individuals have faced and responded to crises, Kamala Harris's adaptability is often viewed more positively in terms of her public health response and focus on equitable recovery. In contrast, Trump's adaptability is more associated with pro-business policies, although his response to immediate crises has been more controversial. 11. Listening to constituents. Actively seeking feedback and engaging with the community through forums, town halls, and other means to understand their needs and concerns. While both Kamala Harris and Donald Trump have their unique methods of engaging with constituents, their effectiveness can be seen in different lights. Kamala Harris demonstrates a more traditional political approach by actively engaging in community discussions, listening sessions, and focusing on issues that disproportionately affect marginalized groups. Her legislative work tends to reflect a commitment to the voices of her constituents. Donald Trump employs a more direct and immediate communication style that resonates with his base, often responding enthusiastically to his supporters in rallies. However, his approach has been criticized for occasionally dismissing opposing views and concerns, leading to perceptions that he may not listen as effectively to all constituents. Ultimately, the effectiveness of listening can be subjective and influenced by an individual's political beliefs and values. Harris likely appeals to those who value engagement and inclusive policymaking, while Trump resonates with those who appreciate direct communication and assertiveness in addressing their concerns. 12. Upholding democratic principles. Committing to the rule of law, human rights, and democratic governance, ensuring that all citizens have a voice in the political process. In assessing who upholds democratic principles better, Kamala Harris is often viewed as a stronger advocate for democratic norms, focusing on civil rights, transparent governance, and voting rights. Her commitment to these issues reflects an understanding of the principles that underpin a functional democracy. Donald Trump, while appealing to certain democratic values such as populism and voter engagement, has faced significant criticism for actions perceived as undermining democratic institutions, respect for the rule of law, and civil liberties. His approach has raised concerns about the stability of democratic norms during his presidency. Ultimately, opinions on who upholds democratic principles better can vary widely depending on individual political beliefs and perspectives on what those principles should encompass. Harris is typically aligned with traditional interpretations of democratic governance, while Trump's approach has been more polarizing and contentious within the framework of established democratic norms. From an objective standpoint, Kamala Harris is often perceived as more presidential material in terms of her political experience, traditional leadership style, and focus on democratic norms and inclusivity. Her qualifications and roles within government align with what many consider essential traits for a president. Donald Trump, while undeniably a significant figure in recent American political history with a different approach to leadership and communication, has a style that many find unconventional and polarizing. His lack of traditional experience in controversial policies leads some to question his alignment with established presidential norms. Ultimately, views on who is more presidential material depend heavily on individual values, political beliefs, and what one considers essential for effective leadership in the presidency.